You said he was untouchable. $4.2 billion, a penthouse on Fifth Avenue, attorneys who had never lost a case. Marcus Weston entered the Manhattan courtroom with his 26-year-old mistress on his arm, ready to throw away his wife of 25 years like yesterday's trash. He offered her $5 million. That is less than 0.25% of what he was actually worth. He thought she would cry. He thought she would beg. He thought she would take the crumbs he offered her and disappear quietly. He was so very wrong, because the silent woman sitting across from him in the courtroom had spent 2 decades building a trap so perfect and invisible that he wouldn't notice it until the jaws snapped shut on everything he owned. What Marcus didn't know was that his own mother had betrayed him from beyond the grave. What he didn't know was that his daughter would switch sides at the worst possible moment. What he didn't know was that the algorithm on which his entire empire was based had never belonged to him from the very beginning. He stole her work. He stole her youth. He tried to steal her dignity. But Claire Weston was about to take something back. Everything. This isn't just a divorce story. This is a masterclass in patience, strategy, and the most satisfying revenge you will ever witness. Stay until the end, because the moment the judge reads the final verdict, your jaw will drop. Value statement and lesson. Before we begin, here is what this story will teach you. The best revenge is not making him suffer. It is building a life so good that he becomes meaningless. And sometimes, the quietest person in the room is the most dangerous. This story is for every woman who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told she was nothing without him. You are about to witness a woman prove how wrong that belief can be. Meaning of the story. This is more than just entertainment. This is a reminder that the truth does not stay buried forever. It is proof that patience and documentation can triumph over money and power. It is evidence that mothers protect their daughters. Sisters stand by sisters, and the bonds between women can survive anything. Claire lost everything before she won. That is the part most people skip. But you need to hear it, because her lowest point is what makes her victory so sweet. The heavy oak doors of the Manhattan Supreme Court didn't just open. They were pushed open by a security detail that cost more than most families earned in a year. Camera flashes exploded like lightning strikes, bouncing off the polished marble floors and illuminating the face of a man who believed he had already won. Marcus Weston stepped into the chaos with the practiced grin of someone who had never been told no. At 49, he was the undisputed king of Silicon Valley, the face of Weston Technologies, and according to Forbes, the 14th richest man in America, with a net worth of $4.2 billion. His charcoal gray suit cost $12,000. His watch cost more than a house in the suburbs. His teeth were bleached so white, they seemed to glow under the camera flashes. But the cameras weren't just there for him. They were there for the woman clinging to his arm like an accessory, draped in a scarlet dress that left little to the imagination. Tiffany Blake was 26 years old, an Instagram influencer with 2.8 million followers, and, according to every tabloid in America, the future Mrs. Weston. She smiled at the reporters with the confidence of someone who had already spent the money she hoped to inherit. "Mr. Weston!" a reporter shouted from behind the velvet rope. "Is it true you're offering your wife only $5 million in the divorce?" Marcus paused and adjusted his diamond cufflinks with theatrical precision. He winked at the camera. "I am a generous man," he said, his voice carrying that practiced warmth he had perfected in thousands of investor presentations. "But let's just say I believe in fair market value." The crowd laughed. Marcus Weston always knew how to win over an audience. He strutted down the center aisle of the courtroom, Tiffany clattering beside him in stilettos that echoed sharply on the hardwood. He nodded to his legal team, a formation of sharks in $1,000 suits, led by Victor Crane, a man known in New York, legal circles simply as the Butcher. Crane hadn't lost a divorce case in 20 years. His specialty was crushing spouses who dared to ask for what they were owed. "Sit down," Crane whispered, as Marcus slid into the leather chair beside him. "Try to look reasonably modest." "Why?" Marcus whispered back, loosening his tie slightly. "The prenuptial agreement is ironclad. The company is in my name. The offshore accounts are invisible. She gets the lake house in Connecticut and enough pity to last a lifetime. I get everything else." Marcus turned in his chair to look across the aisle. Sitting there was Claire Weston. If Marcus was the sun, burning bright and demanding attention, Claire was a shadow. She wore a navy blue blazer that was at least 3 seasons old. Her dark hair was pulled back into a tight bun. She wore no makeup to hide the dark circles under her eyes, testament to too many sleepless nights, wondering how 25 years of marriage could lead to this moment. She sat almost alone, save for a young woman in a simple gray suit, who looked more like a fresh law student than a seasoned litigator. Her name was Evelyn Rhodes, and Victor Crane had already dismissed her as an inconsequential nuisance. Claire stared straight ahead at the empty judge's bench. Her hands were folded calmly on a stack of manila folders. She didn't look at Marcus. She didn't look at Tiffany. She simply waited. "She looks tired," Tiffany whispered in Marcus's ear, loud enough to carry across the aisle. "Maybe she's ready to give up." "She gave up years ago," Marcus scoffed. "This is just the paperwork." The bailiff's voice boomed through the murmuring room. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Patricia Monroe presiding." Judge Patricia Monroe was a legend in the New York court system. At 61, she had presided over some of the most contentious divorces in the state's history. Her face was weathered, but sharp, her eyes carrying the weight of every lie she had ever heard from the witness stand. Among lawyers, she was known as the Leveler, a judge who had zero tolerance for wealthy men who believed their money made them untouchable. She swept in, her black robes billowing, and took her seat. Her gaze swept across the courtroom, lingering briefly with visible disapproval on Tiffany's inappropriate dress before landing on Marcus. "Be seated," Judge Monroe commanded. "Case number 4, 92-B, Weston v. Weston. Petition for dissolution of marriage and distribution of assets." She flipped through her files with practiced efficiency. "I have reviewed the initial filings. Mr. Crane, you represent the petitioner, Mr. Weston. Ms. Rhodes, you represent the respondent, Mrs. Weston. Is that correct?" "Ready, Your Honor," Crane said, standing with the confidence of a man who had already counted his performance bonus. "Ready, Your Honor," Evelyn Rhodes replied. Her voice was quiet but firm. "Let's not waste time," Judge Monroe said. "Mr. Weston is petitioning for divorce based on irreconcilable differences and seeking enforcement of a prenuptial agreement signed in 1998. Is that correct?" "That is correct, Your Honor," Crane said, stepping into the well of the court. He began to pace, a performance he had perfected over 2 decades. "My client, Mr. Weston, built Weston Technologies from a garage startup into a global empire worth over $30 billion. While he has deep respect for his wife of 25 years, the reality is that the marriage is irretrievably broken. We are offering Mrs. Weston a generous settlement of $5 million, plus the Connecticut property, which is more than fair, considering she has contributed nothing to the business operations for over 2 decades. Marcus leaned back in his chair and crossed his legs. He caught Claire's eyes from across the aisle. She didn't blink. She didn't look angry. She looked calculating. It unsettled him for a brief moment, but then Tiffany squeezed his hand under the table, and the feeling passed. "Ms. Rhodes," Judge Monroe turned to Claire's lawyer, "does the defense contest the validity of the prenuptial agreement?" Evelyn Rhodes stood up slowly. She didn't pace. She didn't make dramatic hand gestures. She simply adjusted her glasses and spoke in a voice that was deceptively calm. "We do not contest the prenuptial agreement, Your Honor." A murmur of surprise rippled through the gallery. Even Marcus blinked. Victor Crane allowed himself a small smirk. "She's giving up already," he whispered to Marcus. "This will be over by lunch." "However," Evelyn continued, her voice hardening slightly, "we do contest the ownership of the assets listed by Mr. Weston. My client contends that Mr. Weston cannot claim the company as marital property for division because Mr. Weston does not actually own Weston Technologies." The courtroom went deathly silent. Marcus laughed. It was a loud, barking sound that echoed off the high ceilings. He quickly covered his mouth, but the damage was done. "Mr. Weston," Judge Monroe snapped, her eyes narrowing, "do you find something amusing?" "I apologize, Your Honor," Marcus said, standing up and flashing his most charming smile. "It's just that there must be a mistake. I am the CEO. My name is literally on the building. I founded the company." "The defense claims otherwise," Judge Monroe said, turning back to Evelyn. "Explain, Ms. Rhodes." "Mr. Weston is indeed the CEO," Evelyn said calmly. "He is a paid employee of Weston Technologies. But the actual ownership of the holding company that controls the intellectual property, the patents, and the majority of voting shares is held by a private trust, and today we intend to prove that the beneficiary of that trust is not Marcus Weston." Marcus leaned over to Crane, his confident smile finally cracking. "What is she talking about? I signed the founding documents myself 20 years ago." Victor Crane was already flipping through his files, his practiced composure slipping. "This is a delay tactic," he whispered. "She's grasping at straws. Let me handle this." But as Marcus looked across the aisle, he saw Claire finally turn her head. She looked him directly in the eye, and for the first time in years, he saw something in her gaze that he didn't recognize. It wasn't love. It wasn't hate. It was the cold, clinical look of a predator watching prey walk into a trap it cannot see. And in that moment, Marcus Weston felt the first flicker of fear he had experienced in 25 years. The first day of the trial hadn't gone as Marcus expected, but he remained confident. Victor Crane assured him that Evelyn Rhodes was bluffing, that there was no way Claire owned anything. The prenup was solid. The company was in his name. The offshore accounts were untraceable. When Marcus returned to his penthouse that evening, he had convinced himself that the temporary discomfort in the courtroom was nothing more than indigestion from the overpriced sushi Tiffany had ordered for lunch. But Claire Weston wasn't at her penthouse that evening. She sat on a park bench in Central Park, clutching her phone with trembling hands, trying to remember how to breathe. The ambush had happened 3 hours before the trial began. Claire had arrived for what she thought was a routine mediation meeting at her lawyer's office. Instead, she found the office empty. Her lawyer, whom she had trusted for months, had left a single note on the desk. "I'm sorry. I cannot continue with your case. Please seek alternative representation." No explanation. No contact information. Just abandonment. Claire had stood in that empty office, staring at the note, feeling the floor give way beneath her feet. It wasn't until she looked at her phone that she understood what had happened. Her bank accounts were frozen. All of them. 25 years of marriage, and she had never thought to open an account solely in her own name. Everything was joint, and Marcus had locked her out. There was a message on the voicemail from Marcus's lawyer, Victor Crane, his voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Mrs. Weston, I must inform you that your husband has filed an emergency motion regarding mental instability. We have obtained a temporary restraining order. You are not permitted to return to the Fifth Avenue residence until further notice. Please make alternative arrangements." Mental instability. The words echoed in Claire's head as she sat on that park bench, watching the sun set over the Manhattan skyline. 25 years. She had given him 25 years of her life. She had dropped out of her PhD program at Columbia to support his dream. She had raised their daughter while he built his empire. She had smiled for the cameras at charity galas while he flirted with younger women in plain sight. And now she sat on a park bench with $47 in her pocket, locked out of her own home, without a lawyer and without a plan. Her phone buzzed. It was a text from her sister Diane. "Saw the news. Where are you? Call me immediately." Claire's fingers shook as she dialed the number. Diane picked up on the first ring. "Claire, what's going on? I just saw Marcus on TV going into court with that Instagram girl. Are you okay?" Claire tried to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, a sound came out that she didn't recognize. It was the sound of 25 years of suppressed pain finally breaking through. "Oh, honey," Diane said, her voice softening. "Where are you? I'm coming to get you right now." "I don't know what to do," Claire finally managed to whisper. "He took everything, Diane. The accounts, the house. My lawyer quit this morning. He filed papers saying I'm mentally unstable." "That lying snake," Diane hissed. "Okay, listen to me. Stay right where you are. I'm getting in the car now. You're coming to my place and staying here. We're going to get through this together." "I gave him everything," Claire's voice broke. "I don't even know who I am anymore." There was a pause on the line. When Diane spoke again, her voice was determined. Her voice was a battle cry. "You are Claire Elizabeth Holloway Weston. You are my little sister. You are the smartest person I've ever known. And that man has spent 25 years making you forget that. But I never forgot. And starting tonight, we're going to remind him exactly who he's messing with." 2 hours later, Claire sat at the small kitchen table in Diane's modest apartment above the bakery she owned in Brooklyn. The contrast to the Fifth Avenue penthouse was stark. The furniture was old. The appliances were older. The walls were decorated with family photos and handwritten recipes. But it was warm and it was safe. Diane set a cup of tea in front of Claire and sat across from her, her face a mask of grim determination. "Okay," she said. "Tell me everything, from the beginning." Claire wrapped her hands around the warm mug and began to talk. She told Diane about the algorithm she had written in 1998 that became the foundation of Weston Technologies. She told her about the patent Marcus had filed while she was recovering from Emma's difficult birth. The patent that should have had her name on it, but didn't. She told her about the offshore account she had discovered 3 months ago when she accidentally intercepted a wire transfer confirmation meant for Marcus's private email. $200 million hidden in the Cayman Islands. Money that should have been marital property. She told her about hiring a forensic accountant to trace the funds, gathering evidence, preparing for a divorce that would finally give her what she deserved. And then she told her about this morning, arriving for mediation only to find her lawyer gone, bought off by Victor Crane to drop her case at the worst possible moment. "Let me get this straight," Diane said slowly. "You had evidence, you had a plan, and they somehow knew exactly what you were doing and sabotaged it before you could act." "Someone talked," Claire said. "Someone on my team. I don't know who." Diane leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. "What about that forensic accountant? The one who found the offshore money?" "Gerald Morrison," Claire said. "I trusted him completely." "Maybe you shouldn't have." Claire looked at her sister, the realization slowly dawning on her. "You think Marcus bought him too?" "Honey," Diane said, reaching across the table to take Claire's hand. "When a man has $4 billion and no conscience, he can buy anyone. The question isn't who he bought. The question is who he can't buy." The next morning, Claire discovered just how far Marcus's reach truly extended. She entered the Manhattan Supreme Court, wearing borrowed clothes from Diane's closet, having spent the night on her sister's lumpy sofa. She had no lawyer. She had no money. She had nothing but the folder of documents she had grabbed from her home office before the security guards escorted her out. And at the entrance to the courtroom, Victor Crane stood waiting for her with a smile that made her skin crawl. "Mrs. Weston," he said smoothly, "I'm glad I caught you before you went in. My client has asked me to extend one final settlement offer. $10 million. That's double what we originally proposed. Sign today, and this all goes away. Claire stared at him. $10 million. That was more money than most people would see in a lifetime. It was also less than 1/4% of what Marcus was actually worth. No, she said. Crane's smile flickered but didn't disappear. Mrs. Weston, I strongly urge you to reconsider. You have no legal representation. Your bank accounts are frozen. The evidence you plan to present has been compromised. You are, if you'll pardon the observation, completely alone. Claire felt the familiar panic rising in her chest. Everything he said was true. She had no lawyer, no money, no plan. But she also had nothing left to lose. Then I will represent myself, she said, pushing past him into the courtroom. Your Honor, Claire said, her voice shaking but clear. I am requesting a 2-week continuance to find new legal counsel. Judge Monroe studied her for a long moment. Then she looked at Victor Crane. Does the petitioner have an objection? Crane stood up, his voice dripping with feigned concern. Your Honor, my client wishes to resolve this matter quickly. Mrs. Weston has had ample time to prepare. A continuance would only delay the inevitable. Judge Monroe's eyes narrowed. Mr. Crane, she said coldly, a woman standing alone against one of the most expensive legal teams in the country is asking for 2 weeks to find representation. I will grant the request, and if I hear another word from you suggesting that basic fairness is an inconvenience, I will hold you in contempt. She slammed her gavel. 2-week continuance granted. Court is adjourned. As Claire gathered her papers with trembling hands, she looked across the aisle at Marcus. He was whispering something to Tiffany, probably already dismissing this small victory as meaningless. But then Claire saw someone else, a young woman sitting in the back of the gallery, watching her with curious eyes. Evelyn Rhodes. After the courtroom cleared, Evelyn approached Claire in the hallway. Mrs. Weston, she said. My name is Evelyn Rhodes. I graduated from Columbia Law School 3 years ago. I've never handled a case this big. I don't have the resources or the staff. But I saw what happened in there, and I think I can help you. Claire looked at this young woman, barely older than her own daughter, offering to fight by her side against a giant. Why would you do that? Claire asked. You know who you'd be up against. Evelyn smiled, and for the first time that day, Claire saw something like hope. Because 15 years ago, Victor Crane destroyed my mother in her divorce, she said. She died penniless and broken. I've spent my entire career waiting for a chance to pay him back. And Mrs. Weston, I think you might be that chance. The command center wasn't in a shiny law firm with a view of the skyline. It was in the cramped back room of Diane's Bakery in Brooklyn, surrounded by flour-dusted shelves and the lingering scent of fresh bread. But in the 2 weeks since Evelyn Rhodes had offered to take Claire's case, it had become the center of operations for the most important legal battle of her life. Papers covered every surface. White boards lined the walls, filled with timelines, connections, and questions that still needed answers. Diane kept them supplied with coffee and pastries, while Evelyn worked 18-hour days, digging through 25 years of financial records. But it was Claire who made the breakthrough. She had been staring at the original patent filing for Weston Technologies, the document that had launched a $30 billion empire. The patent was for a revolutionary data compression algorithm, the kind of mathematical innovation that made computers work faster, store more information, and process data with unprecedented efficiency. Marcus's name was the only one on the filing. April 14th, 1999. The date was burned into Claire's memory for another reason. That was the day after I gave birth to Emma, Claire said quietly, looking up from the document. I was in the hospital for 3 days. There were complications. I almost died. Evelyn stopped typing. He filed the patent while you were in the hospital. Claire nodded, her jaw tightening. I didn't find out until years later. By then, the company was already worth millions. He told me it didn't matter whose name was on the paper. He said we were partners. He said what was his was mine. But the algorithm itself? Evelyn pressed. Where did it come from? Claire was silent for a long moment. Then she walked over to the window, looking down at the Brooklyn street. I was a PhD student in applied mathematics at Columbia. My dissertation was on recursive data compression. I had developed a theoretical model that could revolutionize how computers process information, but I couldn't figure out how to make it practical. She turned to Evelyn. Marcus was a business student, smart, charming, full of big ideas, but no technical knowledge. We met at a party. He heard me talking about my research and became obsessed with it. He said he could turn my theory into a product. He just needed me to explain the math to him. So you taught it to him? I wrote it for him. Claire's voice was bitter. I spent 6 months translating my theoretical model into actual code. I worked nights and weekends while he looked for investors, and when the company took off, I was too busy raising Emma and too naive to realize he had cut me out completely. Do you have any proof? Evelyn asked. Your original research? Notes? Drafts? Anything? Claire shook her head. It was almost 30 years ago. I saved everything on floppy disks. They're long gone. Diane, who had been listening from the doorway, spoke up. What about your PhD advisor, the professor at Columbia? Would he still have records? Claire froze. Professor Harold Bennett, she said slowly. He was my advisor. I dropped out when Emma was born, but he kept all his student files. He was obsessed with documentation. Is he still alive? Evelyn asked, already reaching for her laptop. He'd be almost 80 now, but last I heard, he had retired to Vermont. 3 days later, Claire and Evelyn drove 4 hours north to a small farmhouse outside of Burlington. Harold Bennett was 79 years old, largely deaf, and initially suspicious of the 2 women who showed up unannounced at his door. But when Claire mentioned her maiden name and the research she had been working on in 1997, the old professor's eyes lit up with recognition. Claire Holloway, he said, shaking his head in wonder. The most brilliant student I ever had. I was devastated when you dropped out. That compression algorithm you were developing was years ahead of its time. Do you still have my research files? Claire asked, hardly daring to hope. Professor Bennett laughed. Young lady, I've kept every student file since 1972. My wife calls me a hoarder. I prefer the term archivist. He led them to a barn behind the house that had been converted into storage. Filing cabinets lined the walls, each labeled by year and student name. After an hour of searching, Professor Bennett pulled out a thick folder and handed it to Claire. Inside were her original handwritten notes, dated and initialed by Professor Bennett himself as part of the academic review process. The theoretical framework, the mathematical proofs, the preliminary code she had developed, and the date on the final document was February 18th, 1998, more than a year before Marcus filed his patent. This proves I developed the algorithm, Claire said, her voice trembling. This proves it was my work. Evelyn was already photographing every page. This proves more than that, she said grimly. This proves Marcus Weston committed patent fraud. He filed a patent for intellectual property that didn't belong to him. This could invalidate the entire foundation of his company. Professor Bennett cleared his throat. There's something else you should know, he said. A few months after you dropped out, a young man came to see me, well-dressed, arrogant. He said he was your husband and wanted to buy any copies of your research I might still have. Claire went pale. Marcus was here. I told him I didn't do business with people who circled my students like vultures, Professor Bennett said with satisfaction. I also told him I'd keep those files until the day I died, and if he ever came back, I'd report him to the university's ethics board. He looked at Claire with unexpected gentleness. I always wondered what happened to you, Claire. I always wondered if you knew what that man had done with your work. Claire couldn't speak. Tears were streaming down her face. I know now, she finally managed to say, and I'm going to make sure the whole world knows too. The drive back to New York was silent. Claire sat in the passenger seat, clutching the folder of documents like a lifeline. "This changes everything," Evelyn said, as they crossed the border into Massachusetts. "If we can prove Marcus built his entire empire on stolen intellectual property, we can not only contest the divorce settlement, but the ownership of the company itself." "But there's still the prenup," Claire said. "Even if I can prove the algorithm was mine, the prenup says all business assets belong to him." Evelyn smiled. "That's the thing about prenups. They're contracts, and contracts can be voided if they were signed under false pretenses or coercion." She glanced at Claire. "Tell me about the day you signed that prenup." Claire closed her eyes, remembering a day she had tried to forget. "It was the night before our wedding. 300 guests had already arrived for the ceremony the next morning. Marcus came to me and said his lawyers were insisting on a prenup. He said it was just a formality. He said if I loved him, I'd sign it without reading it." "And if you'd refused?" Claire's voice was bitter. "He said he'd cancel the wedding in front of all those guests. My parents had spent their entire savings on that party. My mother was dying of cancer. She lived just long enough to see me walk down the aisle." She opened her eyes. "So I signed. I gave away everything because I was 22 years old and terrified, and I believed him when he said it didn't matter." "That's coercion," Evelyn said firmly. "That prenup was signed under duress. If we can prove that, we can contest it entirely." For the first time in weeks, Claire felt something that might be hope. But as they drove through the darkness toward New York City, neither of them knew that Marcus Weston had already found out about their visit to Vermont, and he was preparing a counterattack that would make everything they had discovered meaningless. The courtroom was packed for the continuation of the hearing. Word had spread through legal circles that something unusual was happening in the Weston divorce case. Reporters lined the back rows. Board members of Weston Technologies sat in the gallery, their faces grim with concern about what these proceedings might mean for their stock options. Marcus Weston sat at the petitioner's table, his confidence slightly diminished from the first day. Victor Crane had assured him that any evidence Claire found was meaningless. But the old professor in Vermont was a complication they hadn't expected. Still, Marcus reminded himself, Victor had never lost a case. And besides, there was the secret weapon. Claire entered the room with Evelyn Rhodes, both women carrying boxes of documents. Claire had found new strength in the past 2 weeks. She walked with her head high, shoulders back, no longer the shadow that had trembled on the first day. Diane sat in the front row of the gallery, wearing her best church dress and an expression that dared anyone to challenge her presence. "All rise," the bailiff announced. Presiding, the Honorable Judge Patricia Monroe. Judge Monroe took her seat and scanned the courtroom with a keen gaze. "We are continuing the matter of Weston versus Weston. Ms. Rhodes, I understand you have new evidence to present." "Yes, Your Honor," Evelyn said, standing with quiet confidence. "The defense wishes to contest the ownership of Weston Technologies based on patent fraud and theft of intellectual property." A murmur broke out in the gallery. Victor Crane stood up immediately. "Objection, Your Honor. This is a divorce proceeding, not a patent court. The ownership of assets is directly relevant to the distribution of marital property," Evelyn countered. "If the primary asset was built on stolen intellectual property, it affects its status in these proceedings." Judge Monroe considered for a moment. "I will allow the evidence. Proceed, Ms. Rhodes." Evelyn methodically presented the documents from Professor Bennett. The original research notes, the dated records, the timeline showing Claire had developed the compression algorithm more than a year before Marcus's patent filing. She called Professor Harold Bennett as a witness via video link, his voice trembling with age, but his testimony clear. Claire Holloway developed that algorithm. It was entirely her original work. Marcus Weston contributed nothing to the underlying mathematics. When Evelyn finished, the courtroom was silent. Even Marcus's board members looked shaken, but Victor Crane was smiling. Your Honor, he said, standing up slowly. The petitioner does not deny that Mrs. Weston assisted with some early research. However, we have evidence that will put this matter in its proper context. He turned toward the back of the courtroom. We call Emma Weston to the stand. Claire's heart stopped. Her daughter, her 22-year-old daughter Emma, whom she hadn't seen in 3 weeks because Marcus had convinced her to move into his new Tribeca apartment. Emma walked into the courtroom wearing a sleek business suit Claire didn't recognize. Her hair was styled in a way Claire had never seen. She looked like a younger, colder version of herself. She didn't look at her mother as she took the stand. Miss Weston, Victor Crane began, his voice warm and fatherly. I know this is difficult, but can you tell the court about your mother's behavior during your childhood? Emma's voice was flat, as if rehearsed. My mother was emotionally absent. She was always in her own world. She resented my father's success because she couldn't achieve anything herself. Claire felt as if she had been stabbed. And did your mother ever speak about her alleged contributions to your father's company? She complained constantly, Emma said. She said my father stole her ideas, but she never had any proof. It was just jealousy. Victor Crane nodded sympathetically. We would like to enter into evidence a series of text messages between mother and daughter, Your Honor. He handed copies to the judge and to Evelyn. Claire looked at the messages, her hands shaking. They were real texts she had sent Emma over the years. Moments of frustration, complaints about Marcus, angry words sent in moments of weakness. But they had been carefully selected and taken out of context to make her look bitter, unstable, and obsessed. As you can see, Your Honor, Crane said smoothly, Mrs. Weston has a long history of making baseless accusations against her husband. This so-called evidence from Professor Bennett is simply the latest chapter in her campaign of jealousy. Emma continued her testimony, each word a dagger to Claire's heart. My father built this company from nothing. My mother only wanted credit she didn't earn. She never supported him. She only wanted his money. When it was Evelyn's turn to cross-examine, she approached cautiously. Miss Weston, she said gently, do you love your mother? Emma's composure flickered slightly. That's not relevant. Do you love your mother? Evelyn repeated. Objection, Crane shouted, harassing the witness. Withdrawn, Evelyn said. She looked at Emma with something like pity. No further questions. Emma stepped down from the stand without looking at Claire. She walked to the back of the room and sat next to Marcus, who ostentatiously put a proud arm around her shoulders. The cameras caught it all. That night, the headlines were brutal. Billionaire's daughter chooses father over bitter mother. Weston divorce takes ugly turn. Child testifies against mother. Tech heiress says mother was emotionally absent and jealous. Claire sat in the bakery kitchen. The newspapers were spread out before her, and she was unable to cry because she had no tears left. Diane sat across from her, her face a mask of fury. He coached her, Diane said. He spent 3 weeks poisoning her against you. She's my daughter, Claire whispered. How could she say those things? Because she doesn't know the truth, Diane said. She only knows what he's told her, and right now, she believes him. The door to the kitchen opened. An older woman with gray hair and kind eyes walked in. Betty Crawford had been Claire's housekeeper for 15 years. She had seen Emma grow up. She had seen everything. Mrs. Weston, Betty said softly. I heard what happened. I'm so sorry. Claire looked up. Betty, what are you doing here? Betty sat down at the table, her weathered hands folded in her lap. I've watched that man for 15 years, Betty said. I've seen how he treats you. I've seen the lies he tells, and I've kept records. She pulled a worn notebook from her bag. Dates, she said. Times. Names of women he brought to the house when you were traveling. Arguments I overheard. Threats he made. Everything. Claire stared at the notebook. You did this for me? I did it because I knew this day would come, Betty said firmly. and I wanted to make sure you had the truth on your side when it did." Evelyn took the notebook and began to flip through it. Her eyes widened. "This is incredible," she said. "Betty, this is 15 years of documentation. Dates of infidelity, records of financial conversations, evidence of emotional abuse." "I have a good memory," Betty said simply, "and I write things down." But Claire looked at Betty with concern. "If you testify," she said, "Marcus will destroy you. He'll make sure you never find work again." Betty looked her square in the eye. "Mrs. Weston, I'm 58 years old. My husband died last year. I have nothing left to lose. And after watching that man hurt you for 15 years, I'd very much like to finally do something about it." The victory over the prenup came suddenly and felt like a rescue. Evelyn had argued brilliantly before Judge Monroe, presenting witnesses who had been at the wedding 25 years ago. Claire's cousin remembered Marcus threatening to cancel everything the night before. A bridesmaid recalled Claire crying in the bathroom, saying she felt like she had no choice. The prenuptial agreement was signed under duress, Judge Monroe ruled, her voice cutting through the courtroom. "It is hereby voided." Claire had wept with relief. Diane had cheered in the gallery and was nearly escorted out. Even Evelyn, who usually maintained her professional composure, allowed herself a small smile. That night, they celebrated in the bakery with cheap wine and leftover croissants. For the first time in months, Claire laughed. "We might actually win this," she said. Disbelief and hope mingled in her voice. "We are going to win this," Evelyn corrected. "The evidence on the algorithm is holding. Betty's testimony will establish the pattern of abuse, and without the prenup, you're entitled to an equitable distribution of the entire marital estate." Diane raised her glass. "To the downfall of Marcus Weston," she declared. They clinked glasses. 48 hours later, everything collapsed. Claire was at the command center with Evelyn, reviewing documents, when her phone buzzed with a news alert. "Breaking news. Second prenuptial agreement surfaces in Weston case. Wife allegedly signed revised agreement in 2015. Claire's blood ran cold. "What?" she whispered. Evelyn was already pulling up the article. "Marcus Weston's legal team has produced a second prenup, allegedly signed by Claire Weston in 2015. The document, which replaces the original 1998 agreement, contains even more restrictive terms for the division of assets." "There is no second prenup," Claire said, her voice rising in panic. "I never signed anything in 2015. But even as she said it, a memory stirred. Divi tukstoshi piekpadsmitais, the year of the miscarriage. The year she had been on heavy anti-anxiety medication for 3 months, barely able to get out of bed. The year she had signed whatever papers Marcus put in front of her, because she didn't have the strength to read them. "Oh God," Claire breathed. They received the document that afternoon. Victor Crane delivered it personally to Evelyn's office with a smirk that made Claire want to scream. The signature was hers. She recognized her own handwriting, but she had no memory of signing it. The document was dated June 15th, 2015, 3 weeks after her miscarriage during the darkest period of her life. "He did this on purpose," Claire said, staring at the paper. "He waited until I was at my lowest and had me sign everything away." "Can we prove it?" Evelyn asked. "Medical records showing you were incapacitated. I was on prescription medication, antidepressants, sedatives. My doctor would have records." "Then we fight it," Evelyn said firmly. But before they could begin that fight, the next attack came. It started as a viral video on social media, a grainy recording showing Claire meeting a man in a coffee shop, hugging him, sitting close, speaking intimately. The caption read, "Billionaire's wife had secret affair. New evidence surfaces." Within hours, the video had 10 million views. The comments were vicious. "Hypocrite. Gold digger. She was cheating too." Claire stared at the video in disbelief. "That's my cousin Michael," she said. "He lives in Boston. I hadn't seen him in 5 years. We met for coffee while he was in town visiting." But the internet didn't care about explanations. The narrative was already set. Claire Weston was a bitter, jealous woman who had cheated on her billionaire husband and was now trying to steal his money. The harassment began immediately. Death threats in her email, strangers shouting insults at her on the street. Someone threw a brick through the window of Diane's bakery with a note that said, "Home wrecker," and then Betty Crawford was fired. Marcus terminated her employment immediately, without severance, under the guise of restructuring. He then called everyone in his social circle, warning them not to hire her. Within a week, Betty was unemployable among the wealthy families of Manhattan and Connecticut. "He's destroying everyone who helps me," Claire said, her voice hollow with despair. "Anyone who stands by me gets crushed." She sat on the floor of Diane's apartment, her back against the wall, looking more broken than she had that first day on the park bench. Evelyn sat across from her, equally exhausted. "The fake video is devastating," Evelyn admitted. "If we can't prove it's harmless, Judge Monroe will have to take it into account." "How do I prove a negative?" Claire asked. "How do I prove I wasn't having an affair?" There was a knock at the door. Diane opened it to find Betty Crawford standing there, her face drawn but determined. She was holding a thick envelope. "Mrs. Weston," Betty said, "I know you told me to stay away. I know he's trying to hurt anyone who helps you, but I have something you need to see." She handed Claire the envelope. "My daughter works as a paralegal for a firm in Midtown. She overheard something she shouldn't have, about how that video was made." Claire opened the envelope. Inside were printouts of emails between Victor Crane and a private investigator, discussing how to stage and edit footage to make innocent encounters look like romantic meetings. And there was something else, a document with a familiar signature. The order to create the fake video hadn't come from Marcus. It had come from Tiffany Blake. "She's been planning this for years," Evelyn said, reading the documents. "Tiffany isn't just a mistress. She's been targeting Marcus." "But why?" Claire asked. "Look at this," Evelyn said, pulling out another page. "Tiffany hired a private investigator 3 years ago, before she even met Marcus. She researched his net worth, his marriage, his weaknesses. She had a plan." Claire read the documents with growing horror. She wanted the company, Claire realized. She was never interested in Marcus. She wanted Weston Technologies. "And she almost got it," Evelyn said. "If Marcus had divorced you cleanly, married Tiffany, and she had then orchestrated his downfall later, she would have inherited everything." It wasn't just a betrayal by her husband. It was a conspiracy. And Claire was caught in the middle of it, the target of forces she was only now beginning to understand. But as she sat there, holding the evidence of the plot against her, something changed in Claire Weston. For 25 years, she had been the quiet one, the one who accommodated, who avoided conflict and hoped things would get better. That woman was gone. In her place was someone who had lost everything and found that she was still standing. Someone who had been pushed all the way to the bottom and discovered that the only way left to go was up. "Call Evelyn's forensic contacts," Claire said, her voice firm for the first time in weeks. "We need to prove that video is fake. Then we need to find out everything there is to know about Tiffany Blake." She looked at Betty and Diane, the two women who had stood by her when everyone else walked away. "They think they've won because I'm alone," Claire said. "Let's show them what it looks like when someone alone fights back." The package arrived at Diane's apartment at 3 in the morning. Emma Weston stood at the door, shivering in the cold October rain, clutching a USB drive as if it were the only thing keeping her on the earth. Claire opened the door in her bathrobe, her face mirroring shock, pain, hope, and fear in the fraction of a second. "Emma," she whispered. Her daughter didn't speak, couldn't speak. The girl who had stood in that hearing and called her mother emotionally absent now looked as if she hadn't slept in days. Her expensive suit was wrinkled. Her hair was a mess. Her eyes were red from crying. She held out the USB drive with a shaking hand. "Mom," Emma finally managed, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." Claire pulled her daughter into her arms, and they both collapsed into sobs. It took an hour before Emma was calm enough to explain what had happened. Diane made tea, while Evelyn set up a laptop to examine the USB drive. Betty, who had been sleeping on Diane's couch for a week, sat quietly in the corner, her face tight with compassion. "I believed him," Emma said, her hands wrapped around her mug. "Dad told me you were trying to destroy him. He said you were jealous of his success. He said the divorce was your revenge for him being more successful than you." She looked at her mother with tormented eyes. "I wanted to believe him because it was easier to believe him than to think my father is a liar." "What changed?" Claire asked softly. Emma took a shaky breath. "I was looking for a document in his home office, something for a business school application. I opened the wrong folder." She nodded toward the laptop, where Evelyn was reviewing the contents of the USB drive. "It's all there. Emails, financial records, a file called Project Silence." Evelyn's face had gone pale as she scrolled through the files. "Claire," she said quietly, "you need to see this." Project Silence was Marcus's master plan, a 2-year operation designed to not just divorce Claire, but to completely annihilate her. Phase 1, financial isolation, freezing all joint accounts, bribing her lawyer to drop the case, filing motions of mental instability to deny her access to the residence. Phase 2, social destruction, releasing edited footage to suggest infidelity, planting stories in the tabloids, destroying the reputation of anyone who supported her. Phase 3, familial separation, convincing their daughter to testify against her mother, using emotional manipulation and financial incentives to secure loyalty. Phase 4, legal annihilation, producing a second prenup signed during a period of incapacity, using Victor Crane's connections to influence the court proceedings. The end goal: Claire Weston with nothing. No money, no reputation, no family. Complete erasure. Claire read the document with a face of stone. She had known Marcus was cruel. She hadn't known he was so methodical in his cruelty. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was a separate folder labeled Emma. Inside were emails between Marcus and Tiffany, discussing how to manipulate their daughter. "She's naive," Marcus had written. "Tell her what she wants to hear, that she'll be part of the company. She'll do whatever I say." "Useful idiot," Tiffany had replied, just like her mother used to be. And there was one more document, a letter from Stanford University, thanking Marcus for his generous donation and confirming Emma's admission to the business school. Emma's face crumpled as Claire showed her the file. "I didn't earn my spot at Stanford," she whispered. "He bought it." "No," Claire said firmly. "You graduated with honors. You worked harder than anyone in your class. Whatever he did to get you in, you earned your place because you're brilliant." But Emma wasn't done. "There's something else," she said. "Something I have to tell you about the forensic accountant, Gerald Morrison, the one who retracted his testimony." "He didn't retract because he was lying," Emma said. "He retracted because Dad threatened him. But before he did, he sent a file to me 6 months ago. I didn't know what it was. I thought it was spam." "What file?" Claire asked. Emma took the laptop and navigated to an encrypted folder. "He sent me the real evidence," Emma said. "All the offshore accounts, the shell companies, the money trails. He encrypted it so Dad couldn't find it, and he sent it to me because he knew I'd need it eventually." "Why you?" Evelyn asked. Emma looked at her mother. "Because his note said that daughters always find out the truth in the end. He said, when I was ready to see who my father really was, I'd know what to do with it." Claire felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of hope. "Can you decrypt it?" Claire asked. Emma managed a small, watery smile. "Mom, I graduated with a degree in computer science with honors. Of course I can decrypt it. She began to type, her fingers flying across the keys. It took 3 hours to crack the encryption. When the files finally opened, they revealed everything. $200 million hidden in the Cayman Islands, shell companies in Panama and Switzerland, evidence of securities fraud that could land Marcus in prison. And one more thing, a holding company called First Light Trust that appeared to own the majority share of Weston Technologies. "What is the First Light Trust?" Emma asked, frowning at the screen. Evelyn leaned in, reading the incorporation papers. "This is a private trust set up in 2005, she said slowly. "The beneficiary is listed as the aggrieved party in any divorce proceeding involving infidelity by Marcus Weston." She looked up at Claire with astonishment. "Someone set this up to protect you, 20 years ago. Who would do that?" Claire's mind raced through the possibilities. Her family had no money. Her friends had no knowledge of trust law. The only person who would have had both the resources and the legal expertise was Dorothy, Claire breathed. "Who?" Diane asked. "Marcus's mother," Claire said. "Dorothy Weston. She died 5 years ago, but we were close. She never agreed with how Marcus treated me. She used to say her son had inherited his father's ambition, but none of his integrity. She set up a trust to ensure you'd get everything if Marcus cheated," Evelyn said, shaking her head in wonder. She must have known this day would come. Emma navigated deeper into the files and found a scanned document, a handwritten letter dated 2005 in Dorothy Weston's elegant script. "Dear Claire," the letter read, "if you are reading this, then my son has finally shown his true face. I am sorry I couldn't stop him from becoming the man he is, but I could ensure that you have the power to save yourself when the time comes. The First Light Trust transfers the majority share of all Weston holdings to you upon proof of infidelity during your marriage. Use it wisely, and please take care of Emma. She is the only good thing Marcus ever created, and that's only because she's so much like you. With love and regret, Dorothy." Claire held the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely now. "She knew," Claire whispered. "All those years ago, she knew what he would become." Diane put her arm around her sister. "Looks like you had a guardian angel you didn't know about," she said. Emma reached out and took her mother's hand. "What do we do now?" Emma asked. Claire looked at her daughter, her sister, Betty, and Evelyn, the unlikely army that had gathered around her. "Now," Claire said, her voice firm with a strength she hadn't felt in years. "Now we go back to court and finish this." The final day of the hearing arrived on a cold November morning. The Manhattan Supreme Court was surrounded by news trucks and photographers. The story had grown from a celebrity divorce into something much larger. Rumors of fraud and hidden trusts had leaked to the press. Weston Technologies stock had dropped 15% in the past week. Marcus Weston entered the courthouse with Tiffany Blake on his arm, but his stride was no longer as confident as it had been on the first day. Victor Crane walked beside him, his face tight with worry. They had heard the daughter had switched sides. They had heard of new evidence, but they didn't know the full extent of what was coming. Claire entered the courtroom with Evelyn Rhodes, Emma, Diane, and Betty. They walked in together, a united front against the man who had tried to destroy them all. Judge Patricia Monroe took her seat and surveyed the packed room with sharp eyes. "We are continuing the matter of Weston versus Weston for the final hearing," she announced. "I understand there is significant new evidence. Ms. Rhodes, you may proceed." Evelyn stood up, and she radiated a new energy. The young lawyer who had been dismissed as not in the same league was about to prove exactly which league she belonged in. "Your Honor," she began, "over the course of this trial, we have presented evidence that Marcus Weston built his entire company on intellectual property stolen from his wife. We have proven the original prenuptial agreement was signed under duress, We have presented evidence of a systematic campaign to destroy Mrs. Weston's reputation and relationships. She paused, letting her words sink in. Today we present evidence that changes everything. Evelyn called Emma Weston to the stand. Marcus leaned over to Victor Crane, his face pale. What is she doing? What does she have? I don't know, Crane admitted, but this isn't good. Emma took the stand and was sworn in. She looked at her father for the first time, and her eyes weren't angry. They were sad. Miss Weston, Evelyn began gently, you previously testified against your mother in these proceedings. Has your perspective changed? Yes, Emma said, her voice clear. I was manipulated by my father. He lied to me about my mother. He used me as a weapon against her. I deeply regret the pain I caused. Objection! Victor Crane shouted. The witness is clearly under the influence of the opposing party. Judge Monroe gave him a withering look. Mr. Crane, a person is allowed to change their testimony when they discover new information. Overruled. Proceed, Ms. Rhodes. Miss Weston, Evelyn said, can you tell the court what you discovered in your father's records? Emma took a deep breath and described Project Silence. The courtroom listened in shocked fascination as she detailed her father's plans to financially, socially, and emotionally destroy her mother. Then she presented the evidence from Gerald Morrison. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the securities fraud, and finally, the First Light Trust. A murmur broke out in the gallery. Board members of Weston Technologies looked at each other in alarm. Victor Crane was typing furiously on his phone. Silence, Judge Monroe commanded. She studied the trust documents carefully, her face giving nothing away. Mr. Crane, she said finally, does the petitioner wish to respond to this evidence? Victor Crane stood up slowly. For the first time in his career, he looked unsure. Your Honor, we need time to verify the authenticity of these documents. You've had 2 years to verify your own client's finances, Judge Monroe said dryly. The court is not inclined to grant further delays. She turned back to Evelyn. Ms. Rhodes, please summarize your position. Evelyn stood tall. Your Honor, the evidence shows that Marcus Weston stole his wife's intellectual property to build his company. He coerced her into signing a prenuptial agreement. He hid hundreds of millions of dollars in offshore accounts. He committed securities fraud and orchestrated a targeted campaign to destroy the woman who supported him for 25 years. She paused. But most importantly, the evidence shows that the man who claims to own Weston Technologies does not. The First Light Trust, established by his own mother, holds the majority share. And under the terms of that trust, that share transfers to the aggrieved spouse upon proof of infidelity. She looked directly at Marcus. Claire Weston is the rightful owner of Weston Technologies, and we ask this court to recognize that fact. The courtroom exploded. Reporters were typing frantically. Board members were on their phones. Tiffany Blake was already sliding toward the exit. Silence! Judge Monroe shouted, banging her gavel repeatedly. Silence in my courtroom! When the noise finally subsided, she turned to Marcus Weston. Mr. Weston, she said, do you wish to address this evidence? Marcus stood up slowly. His expensive suit suddenly looked wrinkled. His confident posture had collapsed. He looked like a man watching his kingdom burn. This is a conspiracy, he said, his voice breaking. My mother was demented when she set up that trust. My wife manipulated her. These are all lies. Judge Monroe's expression didn't change. Do you have evidence that your mother was not of sound mind when the trust was established? Marcus stammered. I will get evidence. I need time. You had 20 years, Mr. Weston. Judge Monroe took off her glasses and looked him directly in the eye. I have presided over many cases in this courtroom. I have seen lies and truth in equal measure. but I have rarely seen someone so thoroughly undone by their own actions. She put her glasses back on. The court will take a brief recess to review all evidence before the verdict is rendered. Court is adjourned. As the gavel fell, Claire looked across the aisle at her husband of 25 years. Marcus was staring at her with an expression she had never seen before. It was fear. During the recess, Claire stepped outside for a moment. The cold November wind felt cleansing after the stifling tension of the courtroom. Diane found her on the steps of the courthouse. "How do you feel?" Diane asked. Claire considered the question. "I feel like I've lived as someone's shadow for 25 years, and finally, I'm stepping into the light." She looked at her sister. "No matter what happens in there, I've already won. I have my daughter back. I have you. I have the truth." Diane squeezed her hand. "You're going to get much more than that," she said. "I can feel it." The recess ended, and everyone returned to the courtroom. Marcus looked as if he had aged 10 years and 30 minutes. Victor Crane was whispering urgently in his ear, probably discussing damage control. Tiffany Blake was nowhere to be seen. "All rise!" the bailiff announced it. Judge Patricia Monroe entered and took her seat. She flipped through the papers for an eternity. Then she began to speak. Judge Patricia Monroe looked across the courtroom with the weight of 35 years of experience in her eyes. "In my time on this bench," she began, her voice carrying into every corner of the silent room, "I have seen marriages end in tragedy and in relief. I have seen fortunes divided and families torn apart. But I have rarely seen a case that so clearly illustrates the difference between legal cleverness and actual justice." She looked directly at Marcus Weston. "Mr. Weston, you entered this courtroom believing that your money and your lawyers could simply erase 25 years of partnership. You believed that a woman who gave up her career to support your dreams was worth $5 million. You believed that intelligence and cruelty were the same thing." Her voice hardened. "You were wrong." She organized her papers and continued. "The evidence presented in this case is overwhelming. Claire Weston developed the algorithm that became the foundation of Weston Technologies. She did so while Marcus Weston was failing his undergraduate math courses. The patent filed in 1999 should have borne her name. That it did not was because Marcus Weston filed it while his wife was recovering from a difficult birth." She held up Professor Bennett's documents. "The original research notes, dated and witnessed by an academic review board, prove beyond a shadow of a doubt that the intellectual property belonged to Claire Weston. Marcus Weston built a $30 billion empire on his wife's work and gave her zero credit." Marcus shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face ashen. "Furthermore," Judge Monroe continued, "the prenuptial agreement signed in 1998 was obtained through coercion. Multiple witnesses testified that Marcus Weston threatened to cancel the wedding unless Claire signed the document unread. A contract signed under such circumstances is invalid." She set the document aside. The second prenup from 2015 was signed, while Claire Weston was under the influence of prescription medication following a miscarriage. Medical records confirm she was not of sound mind during that period. That document is also invalid. 2 prenups, both worthless. Judge Monroe's voice grew colder. But the legal formalities pale in comparison to the moral bankruptcy revealed in this courtroom. Project Silence. She held up the printouts Emma had provided. A 2-year operation designed to financially, socially, and emotionally destroy a woman. Frozen bank accounts, bribed lawyers, fake evidence of infidelity, the manipulation of a daughter against her own mother. She looked at Marcus with undisguised contempt. "Mr. Weston, I have seen many cruel people in this courtroom, but the calculated, systematic nature of your campaign against the mother of your child puts you in a category all your own." Marcus tried to stand up. "Your Honor, I can explain." "Sit down, Mr. Weston. I am not finished," He sat. Judge Monroe held up the final document. The First Light Trust, she said, established in 2005 by Dorothy Weston, the petitioner's mother. The terms of this trust are clear and legally binding. Upon proof of infidelity by Marcus Weston during his marriage, the majority share of all Weston holdings transfers to Claire Weston. She looked toward Claire. Mrs. Weston, your mother-in-law knew exactly who her son was, and she spent the final years of her life ensuring you had the power to protect yourself when this day came. Judge Monroe set the document down. It is the judgment of this court that Claire Weston is the rightful owner of the majority share of Weston Technologies, as stipulated in the First Light Trust. All offshore accounts held by Marcus Weston in violation of marital disclosure laws are hereby frozen pending further investigation. The petition for divorce is granted, with all assets not protected by the trust to be divided according to the principles of equitable distribution. She paused. Additionally, the evidence of securities fraud and financial manipulation presented in this case will be referred to the District Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. The courtroom erupted. Board members were shouting into their phones. Reporters were running for the doors. Victor Crane looked like he was going to be sick. "Silence," Judge Monroe commanded. "I am not finished." The room went quiet. The court also takes note of the conduct of Victor Crane during these proceedings. There is evidence of Mr. Crane's involvement in bribing opposing counsel and falsifying evidence. This matter will be referred to the Bar Association for investigation. Victor Crane's face turned from pale to gray. Finally, Judge Monroe said, looking directly at Tiffany Blake's empty seat, the court issues a subpoena for Tiffany Blake regarding her role in the creation and distribution of fake video evidence. Miss Blake is to report to the court within 48 hours. She gathered her papers. This case represents everything that is wrong with how some people view marriage. They see it as a transaction instead of a partnership. They see their spouses as assets to be managed instead of human beings to be cherished. She looked at Claire. "Mrs. Weston, you supported a man for 25 years who did not deserve you. You raised a daughter who, despite all manipulation, found her way back to the truth. You survived a campaign of annihilation that would have broken most people." Her voice softened slightly. "You are not broken. And today, justice has been served." She struck her gavel. "Court is adjourned." Marcus Weston sat frozen in his chair, unable to comprehend what had just happened. 20 minutes ago, he had been a billionaire. Now, he faced criminal charges. His company was gone, and his daughter was hugging his ex-wife on the other side of the aisle. Victor Crane was already packing his briefcase, probably calculating how fast he could flee to a country without an extradition treaty. And Claire Weston stood in the courtroom, surrounded by the people who had stood by her when everyone else had left. "You did it," Diane said, tears streaming down her face. "You really did it." "We did it," Claire corrected. "All of us together." Emma held her mother tightly. "I'm so sorry, Mom, for everything." Claire stroked her daughter's hair. "You found your way back. That's all that matters." Betty Crawford stood nearby, clutching her worn notebook. "Mrs. Weston," she said, "I don't even know what to say." Claire turned to her and took both of her hands. "You saved me, Betty. That notebook, 15 years of documentation. Without you, none of this would have happened." "I only wrote down what I saw," Betty said, her voice trembling. "Sometimes that's all it takes," Claire said. "Someone willing to see the truth and remember it." Evelyn Rhodes was accepting congratulations from other lawyers who had come to watch the verdict. The young lawyer who had been dismissed as not in the same league had just won the most prominent divorce case of the decade. "Miss Rhodes," a reporter shouted, "how does it feel to have defeated Victor Crane?" Evelyn smiled. "It feels like justice," she said, "and it was a long time coming." As Claire left the courthouse, cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. but she didn't hear them. She looked up at the sky, breathed in the cold November air, and felt the weight of 25 years finally lift from her shoulders. She had entered that court with nothing. No money, no lawyer, no hope. She walked out as the owner of a $30 billion company. But more importantly, she walked out with her daughter by her side, her sister at her back, and the knowledge that she had survived the worst thing that had ever happened to her, and that was worth more than all the money in the world. 6 months later, the world looked very different. Claire Weston stood at the window of her new office on the 32nd floor of what was now First Light Technologies. The name change had been her first act as chairperson, a tribute to the mother-in-law who had protected her from beyond the grave. The Manhattan skyline stretched out before her, glittering in the spring sunshine. It was the same view Marcus had enjoyed for 20 years, but Claire rarely spent time admiring it. There was too much work to do. "Chairwoman Weston," her assistant appeared in the doorway. "Your 11 o'clock appointment is here. Send them in," Claire said, turning from the window. Evelyn Rhodes walked in, looking quite different from the nervous young lawyer who had approached Claire in that courthouse hallway 6 months ago. She now headed First Light's legal department, with a staff of 20 and a reputation that had grown considerably since the Weston verdict. "The restructuring papers are ready," Evelyn said, laying them on Claire's desk. "We've finished auditing all the offshore holdings. The total repatriated amount is $214 million. Claire nodded. "Transfer it to the foundation account. Everything, every cent." The First Light Foundation had been Claire's second major initiative. It provided legal support and financial aid to women in difficult divorce proceedings, particularly those facing wealthy and powerful opponents. In 6 months, they had helped over 500 women navigate the legal system. Evelyn smiled. "You know, when you first told me about the foundation, I thought you'd at least keep some of the money for yourself." "I have enough," Claire said simply. "More than enough. That money was stolen from our family. It should go toward helping other families." There was a knock at the door. Emma Weston walked in, carrying a laptop and looking visibly excited. "Mom, you have to see this," Emma said. "The beta test results are incredible." Emma had joined as the head of the new AI ethics department at First Light Technologies. Her job was to ensure the company's technology was used responsibly, a stark contrast to the aggressive, profit-at-all-costs approach her father had championed. "The educational software?" Claire asked. Emma nodded eagerly. "The test results in the pilot schools improved by 40%. The teachers say it's the most effective learning tool they've ever seen." Claire felt a warmth in her chest. This was what she had always wanted. For technology not just to make money, but to genuinely help people. "Set a board meeting for next week," Claire said. "I want to talk about expanding the pilot program." Emma made a note on her laptop, then hesitated. "Mom, I have to tell you something." "What is it?" Emma took a deep breath. "Dad's sentencing is next month. His lawyer reached out. He wants to see me." Claire's expression remained neutral, but her hands gripped the edge of her desk slightly tighter. "What do you want to do?" Emma was silent for a moment. "I think I need to go, not to forgive him, but to finally say what I should have said 6 months ago." Claire nodded slowly. "That is your decision. Whatever you decide, I support you." She walked around the desk and took her hands. "Just remember that you don't owe him anything. No forgiveness, no explanation, not even your presence. You go because you choose to, not because he deserves it." Emma hugged her mother tightly. "I know," she whispered. "Thank you for understanding." Later that afternoon, Claire had a very different meeting. Betty Crawford sat across from her in a small cafe near the First Light Technologies building. Betty was now the Community Outreach Director for the First Light Foundation, a job she had initially wanted to turn down. "I still don't know how to run an office," Betty said, shaking her head. "People keep asking me for budget projections." Claire laughed. "You're doing wonderfully. The community programs you've developed are making a real difference. I just talk to people, Betty said. Listen to their stories, try to help where I can. That's exactly what they need, Claire said. Someone who actually listens. Betty was silent for a moment, stirring her coffee. Can I ask you something, Mrs. Weston? Please, call me Claire. Betty smiled. Claire, do you ever regret it? The way it ended with Mr. Weston? Claire thought carefully about the question. I regret the 25 years I spent trying to make something work that never would. I regret not seeing who he really was sooner, until it was almost too late. I regret what it cost Emma to find out the truth about her father. She took a sip of tea. But do I regret fighting back? Do I regret standing up for myself? Do I regret finally being the person I was always meant to be? She shook her head, not for a single moment. That evening, Claire attended a support group meeting at a community center in Brooklyn. She went every week, not as a leader or a donor, but simply as another woman sharing her story. The group sat in a circle on folding chairs. There were lawyers, teachers, and stay-at-home mothers. Some were at the beginning of their divorces, still shocked and terrified. Others were further along, starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel. A young woman named Jennifer spoke up, her voice trembling. I don't know how you survived it, she said to Claire. I read about your case. He tried to destroy you. How did you keep going? Claire thought of the park bench where she had sat with $47 in her pocket. She thought of the sleepless nights in Diane's apartment. She thought of the moment Emma had testified against her. One day at a time, Claire said, one small decision at a time, and by remembering that his version of me was never the real me. She looked around the circle at the faces of women fighting battles similar to her own. The man I was married to spent years making me feel small, invisible, worthless, and for a long time I believed him. I thought I was nothing without him. She leaned forward. But here is what I learned. The story he told about me was not my story. It was his story about me. And I had the power to write a different one. Jennifer wiped her eyes. But you had evidence. You had lawyers. You had resources. What about women who have none of that? That is exactly why the foundation exists, Claire said, to ensure every woman has access to the same tools I had. No one should have to face this alone. After the meeting, Claire walked through the familiar Brooklyn streets to Diane's bakery. The window that had been smashed by vandals was repaired, and the shop was busier than ever. People came from all over the city to buy pastries from the sister of the woman who had defeated Marcus Weston. Diane was behind the counter, dusted in flour, and looking happier than Claire had ever seen her. You're late, Diane said, sliding a cup of coffee across the counter. The meeting ran long, Claire replied. Good conversations. Diane studied her sister for a moment. You know, you could buy 100 bakeries now. You don't have to keep coming here. Claire smiled. This is the place I came to when I had nothing. This is where I found out who my real family is. I'm not going anywhere. She looked around the cozy shop, seeing the mismatched chairs, the handwritten menu board, and the photos on the walls. Besides, she said, your croissants are still the best in all of Brooklyn. Diane laughed. They're the best in Manhattan, too. Don't forget that. 1 year after the verdict, Claire Weston received a package at her apartment. It arrived with no return address, just a small manila envelope, with her name written in a careful script she didn't recognize. Inside was a USB drive and a handwritten note. Mrs. Weston, your husband wasn't the only one with secrets. There are 14 other women. I was one of them. It's all on the drive. Maybe it's time someone told the whole story. A friend. Claire sat at her kitchen table and stared at the note for a long time. Then she plugged the USB drive into her laptop. The files that loaded were devastating. Names, dates, payoffs, non-disclosure agreements stretching back 15 years. Women Marcus had harassed, manipulated, and bought off with money. Secretaries, junior executives, interns barely out of college. 14 women whose stories had been buried under mountains of money and legal threats. Claire read the files with a growing sense of horror. She had known Marcus was unfaithful. She hadn't known he was a predator. She reached for her phone and called Evelyn Rhodes. Evelyn answered on the second ring. "Claire, is everything okay?" "I need you at my apartment," Claire said. "Now, there's something you need to see." When Evelyn arrived an hour later, she reviewed the files, her professional composure slowly crumbling. "This is criminal," Evelyn said. "Some of these women were coerced. Others were threatened. This isn't just infidelity. This is systematic abuse of power." "What do we do?" Claire asked. Evelyn looked up from the laptop. "That depends. Do you want to go public with this?" Claire was silent for a moment, thinking of the 14 women whose names were on that drive. Women who had likely felt just as trapped and helpless as she had over the last 25 years. "I want to find them," Claire said. "I want to give them the choice I never had. The choice to tell their story or not. The choice to seek justice or to find closure." She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city lights. Marcus is already in prison for financial crimes, but those 14 women never had their day in court. They were never allowed to stand up and say what was done to them. She turned to Evelyn. "We find them. We offer them support, legal aid, financial assistance, whatever they need. And if they choose to go public, we stand by them." Evelyn nodded slowly. "This could be huge," she said. "It could change the entire conversation about how powerful men treat women in the corporate world." "Or it could be buried again," Claire said, "the way it was before. That's why we have to be careful. Protecting the women comes first. Their safety and privacy are more important than any public statement." Over the next 3 months, Claire and Evelyn quietly reached out to the 14 women on the list. Some had moved on with their lives and wanted nothing more to do with the past. Claire respected their decision, but 11 of them wanted to speak. They met in a conference room at the First Light Foundation. 11 women who had never met before, but shared a common experience. They shared their stories. Some cried, others were angry, but all were finally free to tell the truth. When the last woman had finished, Claire stood up. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for trusting us with your stories. I know how hard this is." She looked around the room at these women, all survivors. "I spent 25 years being afraid of Marcus Weston, afraid of his money, his lawyers, his power, and for a long time I thought I was the only one. I thought no one would believe me." She took a deep breath. "But I wasn't alone. None of us were alone. We were just kept apart, isolated, made to feel that our experiences didn't matter." She walked to the window. "What happens next is up to each of you. If you want to go public, we will support you. If you want to take legal action, we will provide lawyers. If you want to remain anonymous, we will protect your privacy." She turned back to them. "But whatever you choose, I want you to know one thing. Your story matters. Your voice matters, and you are no longer alone." One by one, the women in that room chose to go public. The story broke 3 weeks later, like a bombshell. 11 women accusing Marcus Weston of harassment, coercion, and abuse of power over a 15-year period. The media coverage was intense. There were denials from Marcus's legal team, but they were soon followed by silence as more evidence surfaced. Marcus Weston's 12-year prison sentence for financial crimes was extended following the investigation into the additional allegations. His name became synonymous with predatory corporate behavior. But for Claire, the public reckoning was less important than the private healing. She watched as those 11 women stood together at a press conference, supporting each other and speaking their truth. She saw the courage it took for them to face the cameras and tell their stories. And she knew that this, even more than any victory in a courtroom, was what justice truly looked like. On the anniversary of the verdict, Claire hosted a small dinner at Diane's bakery. Just family and close friends. Emma and Diane, Betty and Evelyn, the people who had stood by her when everything collapsed. "A toast," Diane said, raising her glass of wine. To Claire, who proved that the quiet ones are often the most dangerous. Everyone laughed. "To family," Claire countered, raising her own glass. "The one you're born into and the one you choose." They clinked glasses. After dinner, Claire stepped outside for a moment. Emma followed her. "Mom," Emma said, "can I ask you something?" "Of course, honey." Emma was silent for a moment, looking up at the stars visible between the Brooklyn buildings. "Do you think Grandma Dorothy knew the whole time? About the other women, I mean?" Claire thought about the question. "I think Dorothy knew her son better than anyone. She saw what he was becoming and couldn't stop it. So she did the only thing she could. She made sure there would be someone strong enough to do something about it when the truth finally came out." She put her arm around her daughter. "She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself, and she trusted that one day you'd find your way back to the truth." Emma leaned into her mother. "I'm glad I did," she whispered. "Me too, honey. Me too." They stood there in the cold night air, mother and daughter, looking up at the stars. Behind them, through the bakery window, they saw Diane laughing at something Betty said. Evelyn was pouring more wine. It looked like a family. It was a family, and Claire realized that this was exactly the happy ending she had never dared to hope for. Not the money, or the company, or the victory in court. Just this: love, connection, the knowledge that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. She had spent 25 years as someone's shadow. Now she was standing in the light, and she would never go back into the darkness again. 5 years later, Claire Weston retired as chairperson of First Light Technologies. The company she had once helped build from nothing was now worth over $50 billion. And more importantly, it was regarded as one of the most ethical companies in America. Emma Weston took over as CEO, becoming the first woman at the helm of the company. Under her leadership, First Light pioneered the use of technology to support victims of domestic violence, providing free safety apps and legal resources for women in danger. Diane's bakery expanded to 3 locations, though she still stood behind the counter in the original Brooklyn shop every morning. She said the fancy new shops didn't feel like hers. Betty Crawford retired at 65, but continued to work as a volunteer for the First Light Foundation. She trained a new generation of advocates, teaching them the importance of documentation and attention to detail. Evelyn Rhodes became one of the most respected lawyers in New York, known for taking on cases other lawyers thought were unwinnable. She never forgot who had given her her first chance, and Claire Weston spent her retirement doing what she loved most: teaching mathematics at a small community college in Brooklyn, mentoring young women who reminded her of herself 30 years ago, and writing her memoirs, which would become a bestseller and inspire a whole generation of women to stand up for themselves. She never spoke to Marcus again. He died in prison 2 years into his extended sentence. Claire didn't attend the funeral, but she visited Dorothy Weston's grave every year on the anniversary of the verdict. She would leave a single white rose and say a quiet thank you to the woman who had seen the truth and planned for the day it would finally come to light. "The best revenge," Claire wrote in her memoirs, "is not making him suffer. It is building a life so good that he becomes meaningless. And that starts with one step: believing you deserve that life." If you've ever felt invisible in your own life, this story is for you. If you know someone going through a difficult time who needs to hear that things can get better, share this story with them. And if you want more stories like this, stories of justice, courage, and women who refuse to be silenced, click the subscribe button and turn on notifications. We release new stories every week. And believe me, You don't want to miss what's coming next. Leave a comment below and tell me, what would you have done in Claire's position? Would you have fought back? Or would you have taken the settlement and walked away? And now, let's begin. Final disclaimer. This content has been carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to provide meaningful entertainment with real-life lessons. Every story we create is designed not just to entertain, but to inspire, educate, and remind you that no matter how dark it seems, the truth always finds a way to come to light. Thank you for being part of our community. Your support means everything to us. And now, here is the story of Claire Weston, the billionaire's wife who lost everything and then took it all back. Would you like me to translate another text or story into English, or perhaps adapt this one for a specific purpose?